Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first virtual lecture of the semester. So, what these little lectures are going to be is just like a condensed, shortened version of the chapter and just kind of explaining some of the important terms and giving you some different examples other than what the book gives you so you have a little more context. And sometimes it's just nice hearing someone explain something out loud. At least it is for me. So, we're going to start with the first half of chapter one, right at the very beginning. And the first question we are going to look at is what is intercultural communication, which is a good question to answer because that's the name of the class. So you should probably know what it means. So, intercultural communication is the process of interacting with people who are different from oneself based on appearance, language, and worldviews. So, it's essentially if you have ever spoken to someone from a group that is different from your own, and that group either looks different from you, speaks a different language, or has a different like belief system than you, then you have communicated interculturally. And I guarantee you, every single person in this class has engaged in intercultural communication already. So it's a pretty simple definition. I think you probably had an idea of what it was going to be before the class even started. But let's talk about why we need intercultural communication. Essentially, why are you taking this class and why is it important? The book talks about globalization, which is essentially the idea that we are all a lot more interconnected now than ever before, and that's because of technology. So we're exposed to a lot more cultures that our ancestors were not able to experience because we have all of this advanced technology at our fingertips that allows us to interact with different groups of people. And an example of this that I think has really exposed me to a lot of different cultures is TikTok. I feel like I have learned so much about like different foods from different cultures, different like cultural dress and attire, and like different traditions and different just so many like different cultural aspects that I never would have been exposed to if it wasn't for that technology. At least like that's what my For You page looks like, but it just shows how really like we're becoming a lot more interconnected. And obviously you want to be able to communicate interculturally because of that. There's also practical reasons. If you're at work and you need to communicate interculturally to get something across, you should be able to do that. If you're not able to do that, you're probably not going to have an easy time working or even interacting with people on an interpersonal level. And then also for political reasons. So the book talks about how in areas where they're not exposed to a lot of different cultures, they tend to have more closed-minded worldviews. And that's that affects how people vote and how people like form their politics. And when we have leaders that are better intercultural communicators, we tend to pass policies and make decisions that honor different cultures and respect all of the different people that exist in the United States. So there's definitely political reasons to be good intercultural communicators. And if you're wondering, so is intercultural communication just learning about every single culture in the world and how to communicate with them specifically? And the answer is no. So the cool part is that there's these general tools that you can use to communicate with all cultures that basically just is communicating with people from an open-minded and respectful perspective and viewpoint, and that's what intercultural communication is. So it's using those tools and like just being patient and open-minded, and that's kind of like the key that gives you the access to communicate to a lot of different cultures. So we're going to get into that later in the semester, but for now, I also want to define culture since that is like one of our objectives for the class. And culture is defined as an accumulated pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by an identifiable group of people with a common history and verbal and nonverbal symbol systems. So, if this all sounded like a bunch of words that sound kind of confusing together, that's okay. That makes sense. I will give you an example to kind of contextualize this and ground this. So, I'll give you an example. For myself, I'm Mexican American. That's one of the cultures that I am part of, and there are values, things that the culture finds important, beliefs, either religious, moral, etc., and behaviors like traditions and like um, music, dance, dress. And by accumulated, it means that it has like grown, right? And it has changed and evolved over time. And all of those like values, beliefs, behaviors are shared, so you keep it going, you share it to the future generations by an identifiable group of people. We know Mexican Americans, in and of themselves, are their own cultural group with a common history, right? You can point back to the history of that group, and verbal and nonverbal symbol systems, which is basically language, right? Verbal language, which could be Spanish, English, or a combination of the two, and nonverbal symbol systems, which is how the group communicates non-verbally. Basically, what culture is a group of people that have a shared history that will pass on their beliefs and values and everything to their future generations. So the definition is very time oriented. There's a past, a present, and a future involved. And if you can think of a group that you're part of that fits into this, then that's one of the cultures that you're a part of. And it doesn't just mean ethnicity, right? It could be your ethnic identity, gender identity, socioeconomic class, the region of where you're from. So many different things can be considered a culture. And so we're going to talk about that later in the class as well. And then the last thing we'll talk about before we end our little lecture is complexity theory. And complexity theory is basically the idea that you can't reduce a culture to one single thing, right? That there's all these different factors that intersect with one another to make a culture exist, and that inherently makes every single person from a culture very, very different because there's so many factors at play that you really can't trace it back to one thing. The idea that culture is fluid and dynamic, and it's impossible to reduce it to one single thing. And I'll give you an example from one of my favorite shows, RuPaul's Drag Race. And this drag queen that is on the screen is her name is Monique Hart, and she has a lot of different cultural identities that kind of make up who she is. So she came from a very, very religious family. She was actually studying to become a priest at one point in their life, right? She's also African American. She's also um, a part of the queer community, a part of the drag community. So there's all these intersecting parts of their culture. And I know there's a term for that called intersectionality, but it's also the idea that we can't look at Monique Hart and just say, we know exactly who she is because she's African American, right? And that means this. No, there's so many different parts of her experience that add to that kind of like shape who she is. So complexity theory is essentially the idea that cultures are very, very, very complex, and that once we understand that, that's kind of like the basis of understanding, oh, we don't really know someone completely because we can't just trace it down to these like little variables. Hopefully that all made sense. If anything did not make sense, of course, you're free to email me, but hopefully that clarified some of these concepts and ideas. And that is our first little mini lecture. Thank you.